I don't see it recovering ever to the levels that we saw leading up to the pandemic.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode here on Smack. This episode features Chris Hartley, CEO of the Global Hotel Alliance, which most of you will know from their loyalty program called Discovery. Chris and I talked about different perspectives of how both leisure and business travel will resume, discussed why business travel will probably never be the same again, and talked about how loyalty programs are changing and adapting to the new normal. Enjoy the show. Chris, thanks for being on the show. Welcome to Smack. I'm going to start with a very simple one here, Chris. If I've never heard of the Global Hotel Alliance, help me out.
Okay, well, how do I help you out with a simple answer? We are a collection of 35 independent hotel brands, some of which you may have heard of, some of which you may never have heard of, who together collaborate around marketing and technology to enable us to reach more customers, more cost efficiency, and compete with the major players, especially in the loyalty arena like Marriott Bonvoy, Accor Live Limitless, Hilton Honors. And we effectively have taken a collaborative approach to global marketing to give the independents a bigger and broader voice, where independently it is often too expensive to reach a global audience as an individual small brand.
Yeah. Now, Chris, if you look at the brands, if you look at the kind of brands that we're talking in terms of the alliance, it's safe to say we're looking at the top tier brands in most, if not all, cases. The Kempinski obviously being a driving factor of the alliance, and but some others in there as well that really stand for luxury on all fronts. How's the last couple of months been then for you and some of your partners? Because I imagine that the travel obviously coming to a halt globally, but especially the luxury area was supposedly hit pretty hard. So can you give me like a brief summary of kind of the last couple of months of what kind of calls you've been in and how things have changed?
Well, we've obviously been affected like everyone in hospitality and the broader travel sector. In the revenues are down substantially over the last 12 months. Actually, interesting, this week is the anniversary of us going into effectively international lockdown. And so a year on, the situation is still pretty bleak. And whether you're a luxury hotel, which most of our brands are, or whether you're in the mid-market, everyone's been affected pretty much equally, I would say, at least until now. But I do see some changes to the way the sort of gradual recovery from that pandemic is going to look. But let's just look back for a second and say, how have we coped financially over the last year? To give you some perspective, we've just reported 2020 numbers aggregated across all of our brands, down around 60% in revenue terms. So that's 2020 over 2019. But I can make that picture more stark if I break that down by segments and say that from the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 until the end of 2020, business travel as a segment was down over 90%. In fact, in Q2, it was down 95%. By the end of the year, it only recovered to about 91% down. And so it just gives you some sort of sense of the scale of the disaster that has faced hospitality industry. And of course, airlines, car rental are affected equally as well. So even if you look across our brands, whether it's Kempinski, whether it's Corinthia, whether it's Pan Pacific, they're all operating the upscale and luxury segments. They've all been hit pretty much equally, regardless of region. I'll give you some more exceptions on that as we go through the conversation later. But it's been a global pandemic, and the impact has been global. And we're all in a pretty bad position at the moment, would be the honest answer.
Yeah. And And now, we're 12 months in, as you said. We're celebrating a not particularly worthy anniversary, but hey, here we are, with the pandemic being around, or the lockdown being around for a year. What's the situation like right now, Chris? Do you feel like there's some form of turnaround on the horizon? We've got a couple of vaccines that are now being dished out in one way or another, and people are starting to be vaccinated. What's your take on the situation right now, and can you give me one or two thoughts of maybe some of your members as well, of what you've heard recently? Are the numbers coming back slowly? What's the summer vacation, or the European summer vacation, gonna look like? Are we gonna be able to see some recovery there? What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting because, as I just said, globally, generally everyone's been affected as badly, and it's difficult to pick out any region in terms of the last 12 months that they've all performed so badly. But as you look to the recovery and the rollout of the vaccination campaign, which we hope is going to simulate that recovery, I think the picture is going to look very different region by region. It's also going to look very different segment by segment. So if I were to break that down a little bit, interesting, I just got off a call with our partner brand Event, who own Ridges and QT, for example, in Australia and New Zealand. They were saying that domestic travel has actually held up pretty well in the first few months of this year, but mostly domestic leisure. And that's a theme that I'm going to tell you is recurring as you go around the world. Leisure travel is what's going to really drive the recovery in the first phase. Interesting that a market like Australia, that as we know, has pretty much remained open, at least internally. They were reporting huge declines in business travel, not dissimilar to what I was just referring to. Namely, that even though a market like Australia allows people to continue to travel, business travel, and there are very low cases there, very low hospitalizations, almost none. Business travel has still dropped off dramatically. So the pandemic's having a psychological effect on people and their desire to travel generally. And we see that replicated across other markets where the sort of typical domestic market is quite strong, but business travel hasn't recovered as you might expect it would, like in the United States or China, for example. China was one of the first, ironically, to see an opening up of the economy last year. And although business travel has continued and has not been as depleted as in other markets, it nevertheless remains in a pretty critical position. So I would say, as we look to the recovery, what we'd say is that certainly driven by vaccinations. So markets like here in the UAE, where about 40% of the adult population have now been vaccinated, we expect to see travel opening up, both in terms of the country allowing people to come in and allowing people living here in the UAE to travel internationally if we are going to be accepted in different markets. We're hearing, for example, markets like the Seychelles, which is close to us in the Indian Ocean, is opening up to vaccinated travelers. Greece is saying they're going to do that. Turkey is saying they're going to do that. But all of these changes that in terms of travel restrictions being lifted are really focused on leisure travelers. And we would say we expect in the next few months leading into the Northern Hemisphere summer to see strong demand for leisure travel into destinations that are willing to take either vaccinated or PCR tested travelers. And so we saw that over Christmas, New Year. We actually saw numbers in places like the Maldives and Dubai that were open to international leisure business, performing very well. In some cases, hotels doing better than they did in 2019. We see that pattern being reflected into the Northern Hemisphere summer as well. And then we see leisure travel continuing to recover well through the second half of the year as the vaccination campaign continues to roll out and governments get more confident to open up their economies to international travelers. I believe business travel is an altogether different story, but we'll come back to that in a moment.
Chris, let me ask you this Straight up, do you reckon we're gonna see a shift in trend here as well when we look at leisure travel based on what you just said? Because I've seen and I've heard this from some of the European markets that are around us here in Germany as well. Where we're looking at a trend where all of a sudden traveling locally, or at least within neighboring countries, like you said, Dubai, Seychelles, and so on and so forth. Where that's all of a sudden that's cool again. I remember a time, pre the pandemic, where the further the better. If you were flying around the world to Australia from Europe, that was the coolest vacation you could possibly do. Now, obviously, at the moment, or with the recovery scenario, that's going to bear some risks because you're going to need to travel at least through one other country, whether it's layover in Dubai or Singapore, and then you're going to be in Australia. Now, Australia maybe not the best example because obviously they've done quite well with the pandemic, but is that going to be a new trend where we're looking at all of a sudden local travel is going to be cool again?
I absolutely. I think it's not just going to be cool. It's going to be what customers feel comfortable with in
Or
the
that,
short
yeah,
term.
yeah, yeah.
And I think people are genuinely rediscovering, in some cases, I would confess myself, even after 8 years of living in the UAE, actually discovering for the first time what the local region has to offer.
Mm,
And I think that trend is going to continue. We hear anecdotal evidence that, for example, the UK, my home country, has already sold out 90% of local summer holidays. So vacation homes, hotels in holiday destinations around the globe already sold out for this summer, which would have been unheard of for decades, really, leading up to the pandemic. So, and I think people, after 1 year of being locked down, are starting to appreciate any ability to move around.
mm,
And so I do see that as a trend that will emerge. We've certainly taken the approach with our brands that we want to work very closely with them on trying to identify customers that live locally to their hotels, working with them on promoting packages designed for local travelers,
mm,
and those are proving quite popular. So yeah, I am seeing a world which the airlines don't want to hear, and certainly we don't want to hear in terms of international travel.
sure.
We see a world where people, for the short term at least, will consider local travel, staycations, regional driving as very much a preferable option until the recovery from the pandemic becomes broader spread and is inspiring more confidence in travelers generally. Because I think at the moment, everyone's still looking over their shoulder, wondering what the pandemic still got to throw at us.
Mm. And then, Chris, leading up to that as well, how important do you reckon the whole public image of a country is going to be? And I'll tell you what I mean with that. If we look at countries like Australia, New Zealand, which have very, very early on in the pandemic have run a zero tolerance COVID strategy, right? So they've said as soon as we have 1 or 2 cases in the country or in a city or in a district, we're putting that district in lockdown to get rid of the virus entirely, and then we'll open up again. Whereas you've had other countries, primarily Europe, also some summer destinations, France, Spain, the UK, Germany, and parts, which have not necessarily gotten the best press, and rightly so, in the past couple of weeks in terms of their strategy. Is that in people's minds, or is it more up to the hotel or the property or whatever form of leisure travel you're looking to do to convince the guest that it's safe to travel, or does the image of the country, and you know what I mean with image, play a role in this specific circumstances right now?
Well, I see it slightly differently. I see beyond what customers perceive as safe destinations to travel to, because ironically, it's the countries that have been most cautious that will be least likely to open up in the short term. Australia and New Zealand being good cases in point, very low case numbers. Thailand, for example, very low case numbers, but very strict lockdown in
Mm,
terms of international travel. And so I more see it as customers themselves and their own perception of personal risk. And I think that obviously a vaccinated customer is generally going to feel more confident about traveling. And may therefore have a relatively relaxed attitude about where they can travel to. It'll be more about where they can travel to that will drive their decision making. Clearly, there are going to be destinations that are perceived to have suffered more than most. There are unfortunate use of terms to describe new variants, for example, that have a country name attached to them, which is unfortunate because generally they represent the country a variant was first identified. But for example, Brazil won't be feeling too confident about reemergence of travel when their variant of COVID is getting such bad press at the moment. South Africa for a while, maybe less so recently. Even the UK with its variant was getting a lot of bad press for a while. And so there is an unfortunate side effect of what's happening with this virus, that it's getting geographically, if you like, labeled as worse in certain areas than others. And I think that will have an impact. But ultimately, it's about personal confidence. And I think that comes with vaccinations and proof, ultimately, like in Israel, here in the UAE and the UK, that vaccinations are working and they're preventing you from getting sick. And that's what's going to give people the confidence to start traveling again more than anything else, I believe.
So let's talk about the devil in the room then, Chris. Let's talk about the whole idea of traveling when or only being allowed to travel again when you're vaccinated. Give me your professional opinion, and then give me your personal opinion, or though I would imagine it's probably going to be quite similar on this whole question of what is a good way here. Are we going to let people travel when they've done a PCR test, or is it only going to be appropriate to travel going forward if you've actually gotten a vaccination of a vaccine that's deemed to be working? And my second question with that is how important is it for our industry to have some form of global way of tracking whether someone is vaccinated or not, whether that's an app, a booklet. I don't, I'm not in those discussions, but how important is it for us to be able to walk into a hotel and say, here is my passport, this is my credit card, and here's my proof of vaccination? Is that going to be a new thing? Because I remember times when you walked into a hotel and said, here's my credit card and here's my passport. And now I'm going to have a little bit more than that, I would assume, when I walk into a hotel.
Well, I certainly think it's clear that proof of some sort of a health certificate is going to be required for the foreseeable future. So what I question is whether it's likely or not, and I'm intrigued by the developments this week in the Seychelles and in Greece and a few other markets that have declared that they're ready to receive vaccinated travelers. They seem to be saying they're also willing to receive travelers that arrive with a PCR negative test. So I would argue that there will be a dovetailing of those technologies around PCR and vaccinations that enable people to choose one or the other or both based on what countries require. And I'm guessing, based on what I'm seeing and hearing, that both are going to still be necessary for a while. Namely, a vaccinated traveler will still require a PCR test, and that countries that are accepting vaccinated travelers will, to a certain degree, still accept people with just a PCR test on the basis that no one wants to exclude what are unfortunately going to remain, I believe, large chunks of populations who don't want to get vaccinated or don't feel it's necessary to. For example, people who've already had COVID, especially the younger generation. So I feel those two requirements are going to go hand in hand for a while. But yes, I do see. I mean, I personally experienced the requirement for vaccinations in the past with yellow fever certificates, and I've never questioned that. It was just that was a requirement to enter a country. I believe that's going to be the same case with the vaccination passports in whatever form they may take. Unfortunately, I don't think there will be a one solution, a World Health Organization app or something for a while. But I think it will come pretty quickly, and I think it's going to be part and parcel of traveling for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I largely agree, Chris. I think that it's there's a lot of one or two details that still need to be defined, but I largely agree that I think somebody who was vaccinated, um, regardless of why they are vaccinated, whether it's because of their age, because of previous illnesses, or if simply because their country is doing better, I think you should be allowed to do a little bit more than someone that isn't. That's just common sense in my opinion. So I largely agree with that. Let's talk about another devil in the room then, Chris. Let's talk about a small topic called business travel. Is that coming back, Chris, or are we just gonna have to accept that the Zooms and the the Microsoft Teams and the Skypes and if God knows what else there is these days, is just taken over a good 30, 40, 50% of business travel the way we know it, simply because someone is no longer going to get on a plane from Frankfurt to Dubai to have a 3-hour meeting and then fly back the same evening. As much as we love Emirates and Lufthansa and all of these guys, but is that
Yeah.
still necessary?
Well, I could give the travel industry optimistic view, which is we're all going to be traveling on business again as soon as we can, and we'll be back to normal within a couple of years. I unfortunately don't believe that. So my personal view is business travel has been changed forever by the pandemic. And I've got, at least for me personally, several good reasons why I would back that argument up. I mean, first of all, it's worth pointing out that business travel is an absolutely huge revenue generator globally. The numbers are staggering. I think over $1.3 trillion in value to the global economy, business travel represents. But any segment that, or any business that can drop as dramatically as 95%, which is what happened in 2020, means that something happened worse than just the crisis itself. And 95% is so devastating a drop that you have to ask yourself the question, is part of that going to be permanent? And I think the answer is it must be, because the fact that it dropped so rapidly and so conclusively, to me, means that there were bigger reasons the pandemic that was happening. The first one is, as you mentioned, technology. I think technology was on the cusp. We've had conference calls for years, but the notion that we can talk face to face with multiple people doing presentations at the press of a button, that changed dramatically around the time the pandemic started. And I think there's no getting away from the fact that it's a far more efficient way of meeting with people. It doesn't involve 24 hours travel, costs, especially if it was long haul. It could be $5,000, $10,000, and you've got to have overnight stays and all the associated costs with that. So to remove that cost from a business and replace it by technology, which seems to a large extent to adequately replace it, I think you have to question whether companies are going to allow that expense to come back. And anecdotally, again, we heard last year that Amazon alone saved $1 billion in business travel expenses. Well, I'm not sure the CFO who's going to propose that they put that back into their budget is going to be welcome to the board. Is going to be welcome into the boardroom. So, that's the first problem is technology. So budget becomes the second problem, and that is that once a business cuts costs, it tends not to put that cost back in very quickly. You may increase business travel by 10% or 20% and say we need a bit more, but you don't go in and double your business travel costs overnight. And so people are going to get used to those lower budgets, and they're going to be reluctant to put those costs back into their business at the expense of margins, which are already under pressure because of the pandemic. Another one is habit. I mean, it's interesting. I traveled every week for most of my career, and that's 25 years or so. It was a habit that I got into for good or for bad. I enjoyed it. And that was part of the reason I traveled. And I think a lot of people enjoyed what came with business travel. In fact, a survey I read recently said the number one reason people said they like business travel was because of non-business reasons, namely they got to discover new locations and visit new
Sure.
places. So that's certainly a good reason to travel, and I think that's why the leisure segment will continue to flourish. But it's also a habit you can get out of, and once you stop traveling, you learn to enjoy other aspects of your life and your work, and I think therefore people will not naturally just drift back to traveling every week. People like me, as they did before the pandemic. I think there's a sustainability issue that has become a bigger issue over the last 5 years or so, but has now been re-examined again during the pandemic, namely the lack of global air travel, for example, has potentially depolluted the environment a little bit. Whether the extent to which that is reality is one thing, but the perception is that not traveling is potentially a good thing from a company CSR point of view. And I think I'm afraid to say the general perception of corporate entertainment has taken a hit pre-pandemic. People were reluctant to spend as much money on expenses, on what we'd call wining and dining, which is core to the hospitality sector,
Sure.
because it was starting with the new generation of shall we say, CSR conscious companies, that it wasn't necessarily appropriate to be spending large amounts of money on sort of corporate entertainment in the way we were used to, maybe for those of us working in the 90s or early 2000s. So anyway, I've just given you lots of reasons why I think business travel is under pressure. And of course, the last one is health, and that is that companies' perception of risk and the health and well-being of their company executives is going to be taken very seriously. And no company is going to be rushing its people into planes and traveling around the world until they're very, very confident that there is actually zero risk to them getting a situation either that they're caught in a country they don't want to be in, or that they find themselves hospitalized with COVID while they're on company business. And so that itself is going to affect decisions around business travel. My summary to all of that is business travel is under enormous and arguably irreparable pressure that I don't see it recovering ever to the levels that we saw leading up to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points you mentioned that very few people think about. If you think about business travel, it's not just the hotels, right? There's like you said, there's a whole array of things that comes with travel. It's the airlines, it's the rental cars, it's even the taxi companies in the local cities, right? They lived off business travelers. You jumped into in most European countries, and I know in some Asian countries as well, and in the US it's the Ubers and whatever else it may be. You got to the airport, you got to the train station, you jumped into a cab. It was that simple. And most business travelers held in their business credit card as if it was candy. And all these industries, I think, just will have to accept that it's not coming back the way it was. And business travel and traveling as a whole was just on such a high prior to the pandemic that obviously the downfall was potentially pretty steep. And I think especially business travel has hit that. Let's talk about some fun topics then, Chris, shall we? Let's talk about loyalty programs, everything that you guys do with Discovery. Now I've heard a couple of statistics of people who has said recently that if we look at loyalty programs and generating loyalty, which is obviously the core of loyalty programs, it's going to also become a little bit more difficult post pandemic, and trying to get people to become loyal to a brand has always been a challenging thing. What's your take on all of that? Is your job going to get easier, or the job of your team going to get easier, or is it going to maybe become even more difficult for the reasons you just explained? People are more reluctant to travel. You're going to have to convince them even harder, to continuously go to a hotel of the Global Hotel Alliance. What's your take on that?
It's interesting. It's certainly going to change.
Right.
I would argue that loyalty, brand loyalty, is going to be as important. it's almost self-evident to a brand's well-being. The loyalty of their customers is going to be as important as it ever was post-pandemic. But the way we in the hospitality sector approach it is going to be very different. I think primarily because of what I just explained about business travel being unlikely to recover to the extent it did before, plus that it has largely been commoditized. So companies basically tell their employees where they're going to stay, and the pressure they put on hotel groups to give them the lowest possible pricing is only going to increase. And so the typical loyalty of a business travel that we relied on to build a good database, they were our lucrative customers. We captured that data, we gave them rewards, and then we encouraged them to come back for leisure purposes. I think it's going to change dramatically in the same way that the airlines created an entire class around business travelers. Business class used to be in the old days first class, and then they created business class, and first class sort of became an elite leisure-oriented class. I think we're going to see that happening again. I think you're going to see that the notion of business class travelers squeeze, and therefore we, the airlines and hotel groups, have built our loyalty programs around the volume business traveler and a very lucrative business traveler who spent business class prices on flights and stayed in luxury hotels. I think, for the reasons I've already stated, that segment's going to be hit very hard. And so what we're going to see, though, I think, is a continued growth in leisure travel. It's interesting, the airlines had said prior to the pandemic that they saw the total volume of airline passengers doubling pretty much between now and 2037. So taking a sort of pre-pandemic, a 20-year view, from 4.2 billion passengers a year to around 8.2 billion passengers by 2037. So the first question is, do any of us see those numbers dramatically changing in terms of a long-term forecast? And I think no, probably not. But if you look within those numbers, who's going to make up the bulk of those travelers? My answer is going to be it's leisure travelers. So I think we're going to see a focus of the hospitality and airline sector on premium leisure. We certainly will be taking that approach, which is that we see that loyal customers of the future being driven by the ultimate end consumer, the person that really gets to decide where they stay. And so brands are going to have to take a very different approach. We've already seen that with what we've done with Global Hotel Alliance and the Discovery Program is creating what we call local experiences. So our whole loyalty program was built around experiential travel and not about free nights, which the big brands tended to do. And if you look at the brands we've got within the organization, we've tended to target owner operators, independents, who are very much niche, high-end luxury leisure brands. I would say Corinthia or Capella or Anantara or Leela or Kempinski, you mentioned earlier, Viceroy Hotels. They're all brands that resonate well with the leisure traveler. And I see very much that leisure travel will continue to see increased spend. People will get back to traveling long haul. It will take a while, but we'll also see the growth of in importance of local loyalty programs in the local market, where we're going to need to get better at capturing data in the local vicinity of hotels so that we can attract people into our hotels who are not traveling. We did a survey on our customer database of 70 million customers recently to identify how close they live to our hotels, because we felt during the pandemic we would, in particular, for the foreseeable future, certainly 2021, we'd need to be able to target customers living nearby. And we identified out of 70 million customers, about 5 or 6 million of them who live within 50-mile radius of our hotels. So that means they'd be typically a target audience for a staycation or for maybe even food and beverage promotions. So I see very much loyalty programs going in that direction. But overall, the need for big brands, and in our case, small brands, but collaborating together to capture customer data and to use that customer data in a relevant way when people are traveling and when they're not traveling is going to become more and more important. And so that's where I see the future of loyalty drifting. It will still be about recognizing and rewarding customers and effectively thanking them for their loyalty to a business through a strong loyalty proposition, but very much aimed at the discretionary high-end leisure travelers, certainly from our point of view, than the more mass market sort of price-driven. Certainly in the future, we see a price-driven business traveler.
And then if we look at loyalty programs and based on what you just said, Chris, is there a definition of a good loyalty program, or do you reckon the pandemic has sort of brought a bigger diversity into what a good loyalty program might be? And my second question in relation to that is, how regional is our loyalty programs going to become? Because we just said earlier, regional travel, local travel is all of a sudden going to become a norm again, where before it was, the further the better. And you appreciated the fact that if you were traveling to a country 10,000 kilometers away, you would still have your Kempinski hotel there or your Corinthia hotel there, and you would know, all right, it's part of the Global Hotel Alliance, so I know I'm going to get a certain standard of service. How is that gonna how is the new travel or the changed way of traveling going to affect loyalty programs then, in your opinion?
Well, I think the two are quite. I think those two points are quite closely linked. Interestingly, so you talk about how we're going to define the success of loyalty programs in the future, and I don't think it's going to be, as it was historically, about capturing the share of wallet of your typical international traveler as they go from country to country. I think it's very much going to be about engagement at a personal level with a brand or, in our case, a group of brands, or it could be partnerships, brands that across different sectors are partnering with each other. And I think that's then not just about travel. Another interesting statistic is of our 17 million members, our research asking them how often they travel away from home each year, again, pre-pandemic, was 27 days a year. Typically, our customers were traveling away from home. So that's quite a lot. So it demonstrates the sort of audience that we had in our loyalty program. But that's only 7%, 8% of the year, right? So the other 93% of the year, they're sitting at home and we're not engaging with them. I think the definition of success for loyalty programs in the future is how you can create a customer proposition that inspires these people to engage with you more regularly, more frequently, around a more diverse product. And that cannot simply be, I reward you when you travel to the Maldives or to Sydney or to New York. I'm going to give you value from being part of our loyalty program 365 days a year. Now, one element of that is, okay, what can I offer you locally? I always tell our teams to look at what the big brands are doing, because they tend to, in a city like Dubai, have a lot of properties. Marriott, I think, has got 30 or 40 properties here. For example, in Dubai, we've got 15 or so. So I'm like, what can we do to engage with the 30 or 40,000 Discovery members that live in the UAE? What can we offer them so that we can have a closer relationship with them? Can we offer them something this weekend? It's Thursday here in Dubai, weekend coming up tomorrow. If we know that they live here in Dubai, what are we doing to engage with them here? Maybe push notifying them a little special offer that's going on this weekend, getting them into our hotels when music venues open up again. If you've got something happening in a hotel that you can invite them to, some sort of event or a sports event that you're partnering with. So I think making loyalty programs overall broader in what they are able to offer, and that's where experiences come in. I think you're going to see hotel groups partnering more with event management companies, with concerts, musicians, sports, all of these things that basically are going to attract customers to engage with you all year round and not just when you're traveling. So to me, that's the biggest change and will define success of these big loyalty programs in the future.
If you had to, Chris, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, if you had to name, or this might be quite easy for you actually, I don't know. If you had to name a loyalty program that you find that works well, in hospitality, that is not Global Hotel Alliance, because I realize obviously that you would say that as probably right up there in position one. But let's take that out of the picture for a second. What are some loyalty programs where you feel, yeah, good message, you like the brand of the loyalty program, you like the way they go about the loyalty features for their for their members. What's one that you would enjoy? And I would also like your take, and I realize I'm really putting you on icy fields here, of what the old Starwood preferred guest. Those of us that remember SPG, was that really the top tier, and were those the guys that really put loyalty programs on the map? Because that was, at least from my perception, what people referred to as probably the best loyalty program out there at the time, when it existed.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. I would have said to you without hesitation that I think the most aspirational hospitality loyalty program that's ever been created globally was Starwood Preferred Guest. I think SPG, to a certain extent, was a role model for us when we started Global Hotel Alliance back in 2004, when we created Discovery in 2010. And the reason for that was the diversity and richness of the brand portfolio that they had. I'll test my memory to reel them off the tip of my tongue, but whether it was Meridian or W or Westin or Sheraton or St. Regis, they had a very eclectic group of aspirational brands, upscale and luxury, business travel and leisure travel, and they were very consistent at delivery and very good at recognition. And it really was certainly the type of traveler that I would engage with. So within my friendship group, for example, when we talked about loyalty programs and we were building the Discovery program, it was always SPG that came out as people's preferred program. I, to a certain extent, if looking at it competitively, was happy to see when they merged with Marriott and created Bonvoy, because to a certain extent, Marriott was the antithesis to Starwood Preferred Guest. Starwood Preferred Guest had all these rich brands, and Marriott was just Marriott this, Marriott that, Marriott Courtyard, Marriott, JW Marriott. And it was everything that was sort of the old business travel of the 1980s, where everything was the same and standardized, and that worked well in the 80s, but didn't work well in the 2010s. And suddenly there was Starwood, and it was sort of wrapped under Marriott Bonvoy. Of course, I think they've done a great job launching it. They've spent a fortune doing that, and I'm not saying that all those Starwood brands aren't great today, but somehow they seem to have been, shall we say, diluted under the Marriott umbrella, and I'm not sure it's quite as potent a brand as it was historically, but they're still all there, and I think that they're doing a great job, and they're also evolving to be more experiential. And of course, what makes me laugh is when I look at our brands. We don't have $700 million, which Marriott allegedly spent to launch Bonvoy in 2019. But we do have a great stable of brands. And what I love is that if you actually look at what Accor's doing now, what Hilton's doing, what IHG with the purchase, ridiculous prices they spent for Regent and Six Senses, desperate to get into the lifestyle luxury sort of group of brands. Accor doing the same. Till the pandemic, they were paying crazy money to just buy all of these brands to broaden their image in terms of the richness of that offer. Of course, they already had Swiss Hotel and Raffles and Fairmont, but then they were added Orient Express and Mövenpick, and they just recently bought Baena and Hoxton, and good for them. I mean, they've been overpaying in order to create a far richer portfolio of offerings for their customers to try and be what SPG used to be, what Marriott's created with Bonvoy, what Intercon's trying to do. What we actually have at Global Hotel Alliance, I could just keep going, but I would say each and every one of our brands is up there with any of those brands that I just mentioned that have been bought by the big guys. But together we, Nikki Beach, Sun international. We just signed recently in South Africa the Meritage Collection in California, JA Resorts here in Dubai, Fauchon in Paris, the Doyle Collection. These are all brands that would fit perfectly into the stable of the big guys, but they want to stay independent. They don't want to be part of those big brand programs. And so I think our opportunity, and I don't have the marketing dollars that they have, but our opportunity is to keep these brands together under the Discovery umbrella. We're gonna launch a more exciting program at the end of this year, and to try and create an alternative or maintain an alternative to these big brand stables and the big public companies who have to keep growing, and ultimately will just keep, in my view, keep diluting their proposition. And that's what I'm trying to do with Discovery. So that was a long way of saying that SPG, I think, was historically the one we all aspired to. And luckily or unluckily, if you're a customer, that's now gone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, Chris. I think, if we look back at SPG and the history they had, that they really, the people that were involved with SPG at the time, and I'm fortunate to know one or two of them, were just, they raised the level of an entire sector of the industry, which is the loyalty area. Chris, just like that, 45 minutes have passed. So I am gonna try and come to a close here and just ask you a couple of questions, because I can't let someone as experienced and as traveled as you just leave. Give me a couple of favorites, Chris. Give me your the best hotel, or your favorite hotel you've ever been to, for leisure and for business purposes. I realize those would be probably different. What's a if you were talking to a friend and they asked the best hotel, and not necessarily in terms of price or standards, but what's an experience that you wouldn't want to miss?
It's really very difficult, and I would be doing a disservice to the amazing brands we've got within the Alliance. But I've traveled around them for the 17 years that I've been running the Alliance, and I'll pick out a few, and I apologize to anyone in our brands listening who feels that I've forgotten one of their great properties that I've stayed at. But hometown, home country, the Corinthia in London is one of my favorite properties. Yeah. They literally redefined the luxury hotel scene in London. No one believed that hotel in that location in Whitehall could compete with the Dorchesters and the Savoys. But they not only did it, but they did it with gusto. They've become the A-list hotel for London. And there's something serene about staying in that hotel, not just the luxury, but the food and beverage offerings, the amazing spa. So yeah, that'd be one example. If you want to be at the center of a fun, and one of my favorite cities, not too far away from London, is the Westbury in Dublin, part of the Doyle Collection. You're right on, right in the town center, Grafton Street, where all the fun and lively noise and music, at least in the good times, is. And I think that's an amazing hotel. I go to India and say the Leela Palace in Udaipur, which was recently actually voted Travel and Leisure's #1 hotel. Amazing experience. The Capella Hotel in Ubud in Bali. Kempinski Sharam Palace in Istanbul, one of my favorite hotels. I could go on. There are so many, and I've been so fortunate to travel to these places and to have the hospitality of these different brands. The Viceroy Hermitage in Beverly Hills, for example, which was voted by our customers one of their favorite hotels. And so the list continues, but I'll stop there. Otherwise, we'll need another 45 minutes.
And Chris, give me an airline that you particularly enjoy. If you were to recommend to someone who's never traveled, and I realize probably most people that listen to the podcast have, but give me an airline where you think the service has just been top notch. And I imagine I know the answer, but I'll ask anyways.
Well, I'm sitting in the UAE and in Dubai, and I'm neighbors and we're partners with the biggest international airline in the world, Emirates, and it's difficult to look much further than that in terms of the guest experience, especially when you live here in Dubai, from the chauffeur drive, the lounges, the onboard experience, especially the A380s, which unfortunately are becoming less popular these days. But I think Emirates still has the biggest fleet of A380s, and from a customer experience point of view, it's second to none. And they've got an amazing loyalty program. I have to say, I've been at the top tier of the Emirates Skywards program since it began, and they keep reinventing it. They've been very good not only at sort of rewarding you in flight in terms of benefits associated with flying, but also, I often get or I used to, pre-pandemic, a phone call inviting me to the Emirates Jazz Festival or to the Rugby Sevens. And so they did a great job at looking after us in terms of, non-flight experiences. And I've always appreciated that. So that would certainly be difficult to think of another airline that came close in that regards. But yeah, I'm biased sitting here in the UAE. Well, very fortunate as well to have that great airline on my doorstep.
Yeah. Maybe we can invite our friends from British Airways to come over once in a while to have a look at how it's done. Anyway, story for a rainy day. Chris, thanks very much for your time. It's been enlightening to listen to you and your thoughts on travel and the loyalty programs, and we'll see you soon on Smack, Chris. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to our season sponsor, I Reckon You, hospitality's first customer data platform. Their philosophy is to stop buying software and building a framework. Their middleware platform connects a hotel's above property and on-premise systems, creating a frictionless flow of hotel and guest data that enhances the guest journey while increasing operational efficiency. Find out more at ireckonyou.com, and don't forget to check out what there is to know about Smack at smack.media or on our YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook channel. We'll see you next time.